I stared at the pink envelope in Fred Luther's hand, the familiar words already echoing in my mind. Fiona, I like you. A wave of nostalgia washed over me, memories of a time I thought I had escaped. But now, standing in this hallway again, everything came rushing back. The bustling students around us suddenly felt suffocating, their whispers and giggles building into an unbearable cacophony. Is he really doing this? My heart tightened in my chest. Fred wasn't looking at me with admiration. No. His gaze flickered back and forth between me and Rita, the girl who had always been the center of his attention. I could see it in his eyes, the hesitation, the conflict. Rita, ever the perfect desk mate, lowered her head with a flushed face, pretending to be shy. But I saw the way her lips curled into that smug little smile. She knew, didn't she? She knew exactly what Fred was about to do, and she was waiting for the moment to push me out of the way. Fiona, he must like you, she had said many times. I wanted to laugh bitterly at how blind I had been, how easily I had let myself believe it. But now, everything was clear. Rita didn't want Fred for herself. She just wanted me to be the pawn in their little game. I was the shield, the one who took all the blows while they got to play house, secretly dating behind my back, as they used me to get closer to each other. Fiona, I like you. Go out with me. Fred's voice cut through the noise, his words sharp and unfamiliar. I could feel the eyes of the entire class on me. The whispers started to ripple around us like an incoming tide. Is she really going to accept? I can't believe Fiona stole Rita's crush. My chest tightened, a burning sensation rising from the pit of my stomach. The letters on the page blurred before me. Was this what I had gotten myself into in my past life? Was I really going to go through this humiliation again? But no. Not this time. Not again. I glanced at Rita, her eyes wide with surprise and hurt, her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't upset that Fred had confessed to me. No, she was angry because I was the one standing here, holding the power she thought should belong to her. It wasn't love that she felt for Fred. It was pride. A twisted pride that I had been too blind to see before. I stood up slowly, every eye in the room watching me. I felt their gazes like hot coals against my skin. But I wouldn't let their judgment shake me. Not anymore. Not after everything I had gone through in my past life. With a calm I didn't feel, I reached out and grabbed the love letter from Fred's trembling hands. For a moment, I let the weight of it settle in my palm. The letter that once held so much hope for me, the letter that had tied me to this cruel fate, and then, without a second thought, I hurled it at Rita's feet. Sorry, Fred, I said, my voice steady but icy. Your grades are too poor. I prefer someone who excels in academics. A murmur ran through the crowd, but I barely heard it. My eyes locked onto the silent figure beside me, the one who had always been there, the one who would become a billionaire, one day. Kevin. The one I had never noticed before, but the one who had been quietly watching over me. I pointed at him, my heart pounding, but the words coming out of my mouth were clear and final. Like him. I could hear Rita's sharp intake of breath behind me, but I didn't turn around. Fred's face, which had once been filled with arrogant confidence, was now blank with confusion and something that looked suspiciously like regret. But it didn't matter anymore. I had made my choice. I turned away from them, feeling a strange sense of relief. As I walked down the hallway, I could hear the whispers continue, but they didn't reach me anymore. The game was over. I had taken control, and this time, I wouldn't let anyone use me as a pawn again. I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on me as Fred stepped closer, his hand reaching out, forcefully lifting Rita's chin. Her expression didn't falter. but something dark flickered in her eyes. For a split second, her smile faltered, and a chilling, almost sinister look crossed her face. The air around us seemed to freeze, everyone holding their breath. But then, in the blink of an eye, Rita straightened up, her face transforming into an innocent mask, as if nothing had happened. She looked at me, wide-eyed, a perfectly rehearsed look of confusion. Had I imagined it? I shook my head, swallowing the bitter taste of déjà vu. No, I hadn't imagined it. This was all part of their little game, the same game I had been sucked into in my past life. The cruel manipulation, the way they used me to get closer to each other. I could feel the anger bubbling up again, sharper than ever before. "What's wrong, Fiona?" Fred asked, frowning slightly, as if he were trying to figure out what was bothering me. His tone was patronizing, as if I were just some naive girl who didn't understand what was going on. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The words flew out of my mouth before I could even stop them. "All right, stop joking with me," I shouted, the sound of my voice echoing through the hallway, making everyone stop and turn toward us. "I'm so tired of being the third wheel every day. And now at such an important moment, you're still joking with me. I'm really angry." I could see the shock on Fred's face. This wasn't what he expected. It wasn't what he had planned. His eyes darted around, probably looking for an escape, but there was none. Not now. "I've told you before," I continued, my voice growing louder and steadier. "You need to deliver your feelings yourself. You can't always rely on me to pass your love letters. I can't believe a grown man like you is so petty, needing my help to confess. Do you even care about Rita?" The words hit harder than I expected. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. The students around us began to murmur, the pieces falling into place. So, Fred had been using her to pass his letters all this time? The realization spread like wildfire through the crowd. Fred's friends, those loyal followers who had always stood by him, backing him up as he humiliated me in my past life, were now teasing him. "Wow, you've kept this well hidden, not even telling us about your secret relationship with Rita," they joked, their tone mocking. The laughter and teasing continued, but I could see Fred's face pale. His perfect controlled facade was cracking. He was losing control, and it felt like sweet revenge. I turned to Rita, pulling her by the arm, forcing her into the spotlight. "Rita," loudly. "Tell everyone what you think," I said, a twisted smile on my lips. Rita, the girl who had once made me believe we were friends, the girl who had always played the sweet, innocent role while secretly manipulating me, was now flustered. Her face flushed red as she tried to compose herself. She lowered her head, her fingers twisting nervously in front of her. I don't know," she stammered. I didn't let her off the hook. "What do you mean you don't? No? Don't you always tell me how great Fred's body is? If you could, you'd love to have his children." The words hit her like a slap. Her eyes widened and she began to falter. She hadn't expected this. Rita had always been so sure of herself, always acting like the superior one. But now, with Fred's confession hanging in the air, doubt was creeping in. I saw it in the way her hands trembled and how her gaze shifted uneasily toward Fred. "Now the opportunity is right in front of you," I continued, my voice dripping with mock sweetness. "If you don't want Fred, plenty of other girls do." Rita's confidence cracked, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. This was my moment to take back control, to expose the lie I had been living in for so long. Be together! Be together! I shouted, clapping my hands as the crowd joined in. The room filled with the sound of clapping and laughter, mocking them. Let them feel what I felt. Rita's expression finally gave way. She was no longer pretending to be shy. She wasn't the sweet, innocent girl anymore. She was just as ruthless as Fred. She turned to him, her voice almost a whisper, but I could hear it loud and clear. I do, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Fred didn't even wait a second before grabbing her hand. And for a moment, I saw the relief in his eyes. He had won. He had his perfect little girl. But what did that make me? Fred couldn't hold back any longer. His eyes locked on mine, and for a brief moment, his voice cracked. Fiona, don't you like me? The question hung in the air, awkward and out of place. He had just confessed to Rita, and now he was asking me if I liked him. What a fool. Rita's face shifted in an instant, a flash of anger and jealousy flickering across her features. The classmates around us exchanged looks, their confusion growing. Fred had just confessed to Rita, yet here he was, asking if I liked him. What a mess. Before Fred could say another word, I shot back, my voice loud and unyielding. No, I really don't like you. Because your grades are too poor. The laughter around us was immediate. Everyone knew Fred's reputation, his arrogance. But now they saw him for what he truly was. A coward, too afraid to confess his feelings without a third party to help. If you're going to act the whole way, I added, pointing to the corner of the room where the academic genius sat, glasses perched on his nose, his face hidden behind his hair. I like those who are good at studying, like him. The crowd stirred again, and I could feel the academic genius's gaze on me. It was complicated, too much for me to understand. I felt a surge of guilt, but I quickly changed the subject to cover it up. All right, I'm not the main character. Today, I said with a smile. Rita, Fred, you two must be careful when dating. Don't let the teachers find out or it'll be terrible. Remember what happened to me in my past life. Rita's face froze, and I saw the panic in her eyes. She knew. She knew exactly what I was talking about. Fred didn't care about me. Not really. He never did. Not when his mother had slapped me and called me a seductress. He hadn't cared about my suffering. He hadn't cared about anything but his own desires. As the teacher's footsteps echoed. Down the hall, signaling the end of the moment, the crowd began to scatter. Fred released Rita's hand, his smile stiff and uncomfortable. Rita, with a sweet, sugary expression, sat back down. But then, she leaned over to me, her voice low and probing. Fiona, do you really not like Fred? Do you like Aston Wilson? Raised an eyebrow. I think Aston is much better looking than Fred. Rita looked at Aston, who was sitting in the corner, his hair covering his eyes, and awkwardly smiled. Is that so? I didn't answer. I had seen Aston in his prime in my past life, and I knew the truth. Aston was better. He always had been. Month after Fred confessed to me, Aston transferred schools. The next time I saw him was the day after graduation. He appeared on the big screen as a young entrepreneur, wearing gold-rimmed glasses, his hair slightly curled, looking every bit the refined scoundrel. At that time, I was curled up in a dark rental room, watching him climb the billionaire list on the screen. My life had taken a different path, one filled with hardships, struggles, and the suffocating weight of loneliness. After inquiring, I learned that Aston had started his own clothing company right after graduation. While Fred was still deeply entangled with Rita, caught in his web of petty romance and deception, Aston had soared to unimaginable heights. It was clear. Aston was 100 times better than Fred. But did I really like him? Did I dare to pursue him? No. The distance between a cannon fodder like me, who had just clawed her way out of the gutter, and a favored child of the heavens like him, was too great. Rita, watching Aston on the screen, then turned to me with a bit of regret in her expression. Well, I still can't understand your taste, she said with a shrug, but I respect it. Do you want to pursue Aston? I can help you. I smiled, but there was something sharp in my voice as I replied, No need. I'll pursue him myself. I prefer a Love between just two people. I was deliberately mocking her and Fred's situation. Who told them to drag me into their mess? For a moment, Rita's face showed embarrassment, but she quickly recovered, pasting that ever-so-sweet smile back onto her lips. After school, Fred was waiting for Rita and me at the school gate. When he saw me, he hesitated, as if he wanted to say something. But before he could, Rita stepped forward and hooked her arm around his. With a coy little wave, she giggled. "Fiona, I won't be walking you home today. You can go back by yourself." Fred mumbled something under his breath, but he didn't protest. He never did when it came to Rita. I waved my hand with a forced smile. "Wish you both happiness." As they walked away, I rolled my eyes. But then, "Want to go home together?" I froze. That voice, low, familiar, calm. When I turned my head, my breath hitched. Aston Wilson stood there, his hands casually tucked into his pockets, watching me with an unreadable expression. Guilt pricked at me. I had used his name today, thrown him into the fire without his consent, just to divert attention from myself. Just as I was about to refuse, he asked again, "How long do you plan to avoid me?" My throat tightened. Because the truth was, Aston and I were not just ordinary classmates. We had once been the closest of friends. We used to be neighbors, living in the same villa community. Our parents were business partners, and as kids, we did everything together. We'd walk to school hand in hand, play pretend house. He was always the dad, I was the mom, and we'd spend our afternoons arranging tea parties for our teddy bears. He was quiet, so I would drag him around. He wasn't popular, so I helped him make friends. But then, my family's business failed. My father passed away. My mother remarried. I moved out of the villa community and lived alone. And just like that, the invisible line between us grew into a chasm. Aston had come looking for me a few times, but I had always been too scared to face him. It wasn't that I had forgotten him. It was that I had convinced myself that I no longer belonged in his world. I forced an awkward smile. "Avoiding you? What are you talking about?" See, you're always busy with your studies, so I don't dare disturb you." His expression remained unchanged. "I only study at school. After school, I have plenty of time. You can disturb me any time. Besides, didn't you say you like someone good at studying? I can help you with your studies." My face burned. He actually took my offhand remark seriously, I stammered, unable to find a way to explain. Aston studied me for a long moment, and then suddenly, a trace of disappointment flickered in his eyes. He smiled self-deprecatingly. "I understand. You think I'm ugly." I widened my eyes and waved, my hands frantically. "No, I cut myself off, swallowing hard. How could I think he was ugly? I had seen him looking exactly like my type, standing there on the big screen, a man who had carved his own destiny with his own hands. How could I ever think less of him? But the truth was, ever since my family went bankrupt, I had felt like there was an invisible line drawn between us. It wasn't him who had changed. It was me. I was the one who had distanced myself, the one who had been too afraid to bridge the gap. Aston never changed. He was still the same, gentle, courteous, always kind to everyone, and someone as good as him shouldn't fall into self-doubt because of my cowardice. I took a deep breath. "I don't think you're ugly. Let's go home together." Aston's expression softened slightly, and then finally he gave a faint smile. "Okay." He deliberately slowed his pace to match mine. After a while, when the silence stretched too long, he spoke first. "If you want, I can help you with your studies. Didn't you say you wanted to get into a university? Your grades aren't enough." I nodded instinctively, then hesitated. Wait, I never told anyone I wanted to get into a university. Aston's lips curved slightly. I saw it on the wish wall. I blinked. Among nearly 3,000 students in the school, everyone had written their wishes on that wall. And yet, he had seen mine? What a coincidence, I murmured. Not a coincidence. He shook his head. When you were writing, I was standing not far away. I've always been watching you. My breath caught. Even after all these years, even after I had pushed him away, he had still kept me in his thoughts. You don't blame me? I whispered. Aston smiled. I understand you. You've always been strong-willed. After what happened to your family, you wanted to change your fate on your own. I admire that. I stared at him, speechless. So I hope you can get into a university, he continued. If you need help, I'll tutor you. I nodded without thinking. Then he hesitated before saying, Actually, I was surprised you didn't accept Fred's confession today. I scoffed. Of course I wouldn't accept Fred. He may look okay, but he's rotten inside. Aston was silent for a moment, then smiled. So you knew. That's good. I was always worried about how to tell you. My stomach twisted. Wait, what do you mean? Aston explained. My parents and Fred's parents are business partners. They often have dinners together. At a dinner last month, my parents asked me to go with them and pick up Fred on the way. When I went to pick him up, he was just coming out of a nightclub, with girls on both arms. I stiffened. He's not a good person, at least not good enough for you. Aston's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with sincerity. I knew why he was, looking at me like that. When we were kids, we made a pinky promise, never to lie to each other. If there was ever something important, we had to look into each other's eyes and tell the truth sincerely. He hadn't forgotten. I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. I always thought you liked Fred Luther, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't until today that I realized Fred and Rita were always meant to be. A bitter chuckle escaped me, but it tasted like regret. Why didn't you tell me earlier? What if I had accepted Fred's confession today? Would you have never told me any of this? Would he have just let me go? Aston was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with guilt. I'm sorry, Fiona. If you had accepted his confession, I wouldn't have told you. I didn't want to make you sad. I would have just used the cooperation between our families to threaten him, to make sure he treated you well. That's the only thing I had the courage to do. My breath caught. My mind reeled, because suddenly, the pieces from my past life snapped into place. I remembered now, after I accepted Fred's confession, Aston and Fred suddenly became friends. It was strange. A top student and the school heartthrob walking together. At the time, I wondered why Fred would befriend someone as rigid as Aston. But then, something else struck me. During that period, I wasn't bullied at all. Fred treated me well, better than I could have imagined, I had thought. Maybe he did like me, but now I knew better. It wasn't because Fred had changed. It was because Aston had been there, watching, mediating, ensuring that Fred treated me right. And then, the moment Aston transferred schools, everything fell apart. The bullying returned, Fred's attitude shifted, and I was left to fend for myself. Aston had been protecting me all along. Tears blurred my vision. What if he didn't change? I choked out. What if he just pretended to treat me well? Would you have believed him? And then left me, just like before. Aston's breath hitched. He was stunned. Clearly the thought hadn't occurred to him before. We had both been too trusting, too naive. and because of that, our lives had completely diverged. Suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat down, on the roadside, buried my face in my arms, and broke down crying. Aston hovered beside me, panicked, his voice laced with anxiety. "Fiona, it's my fault. I didn't think of this possibility. I won't leave you. I swear." I shot up, tears still fresh on my face. "No swearing," I snapped, pretending to be fierce like I used to when we were kids. "Can't you just let me cry in peace for a little while?" His tense shoulders relaxed, and he let out a small chuckle. "All right, go ahead and cry." And so I did. I cried for everything I had lost, for the past I couldn't change, and for the friend I had ignored for so long. I cried until my chest ached, until the burden of regret lightened, if only slightly. After what felt like an eternity, I wiped my face with the tissue Aston handed me. He smiled softly. "Shall we go home?" I nodded. "Yeah, let's go home." He reached out a hand. "Your backpack?" A small, breathy laugh escaped me. When we were kids, I always made him carry my backpack. Old habits, I supposed. Without a word, I handed it to him, and we walked side by side, just like we used to. After a few steps, I paused, turning to him with a slightly brightened gaze. "Do the words you just said still count? Can you tutor me?" Aston's eyes crinkled with a smile. "Always." The next day, Aston and I walked into the classroom together. The moment we stepped inside, a commotion erupted. A group of girls, led by Ram, gasped in exaggerated excitement. "Oh my God! Fiona, you got Aston so quickly. I knew you really, really liked him." Rita, standing among them, smiled knowingly. "Oh? We live close to each other, so we go to school together," I said flatly, barely sparing her a glance. I had no energy for their games anymore. Rita mistook my silence for shyness and let out a teasing laugh before turning to the class. "By the way, is anyone planning to perform at the coming-of-age ceremony this weekend?" I knew she wasn't asking just for fun. This was her way of steering the conversation toward herself. As the teacher's chosen performer, she wanted everyone's attention on her dance. The class immediately began discussing the event, unaware of her true intentions. But while they were caught up in the excitement, my mind wandered somewhere else, to a memory I wished I could forget. In my past life, this same ceremony had been one of my greatest humiliations. Back then, Rita had convinced me to perform with her. I would sing, and she would dance. But on the day of the event, she conveniently fell ill and never showed up. Meanwhile, Fred's admirers conspired against me, bribing the makeup artists backstage to ruin my appearance. With no mirrors around, I was shoved onto the stage without realizing how awful I looked. The moment the giant screen zoomed in on my distorted makeup, the entire hall erupted in laughter. That day, I lost not just my dignity, but any illusions I had about fitting into their world. Fred's mother had cornered me afterward, her words laced with disgust. She berated me for disgracing the Luther family, as if I had ever asked to be associated with them in the first place. And now, in this life, Rita was once again looking at me with an eager smile. "Fiona, why don't we perform together?" The same question, the same sugary tone. She reached for my arm, tugging playfully. "You sing so well. This is a great opportunity for you to show off." She grabbed the registration form, ready to write my name down. "No, I don't want to participate." My voice was firm, unwavering. Rita's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly masked it. "Oh, that's okay. I'll perform alone then." As expected, the classmates around her immediately showered her with comfort, their attention shifting back to her. I didn't say a word. I had seen this act too many times before, and frankly, I was tired of it. After class, Aston found me in the hallway, his brows slightly furrowed. "What's wrong?" I hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Aston, do you have a dance partner for the coming-of-age ceremony?" In my past life, he never attended the event. Looking back, it was probably because he never had anyone to invite him. Aston blinked, caught off guard. I extended my hand toward him. "Can I invite you to the dance?" His whole body tensed, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. I sighed. "If you don't want to, just forget." "Of course I want to," he blurted out before I could finish. His gaze dropped slightly, his voice softer. I was thinking, I can give you a dress." I raised a brow. "A dress?" He nodded. "I designed it myself." "You design dresses?" My surprise must have been obvious because Aston let out a small smile. "I made it a long time ago. I always thought it would suit you." Something warm flickered in my chest. "Let me see the design." Aston shook his head. "I'll bring the dress to your doorstep the day before the ceremony." "So mysterious," I murmured, but deep down, I couldn't stop the quiet anticipation building within me. When we returned to the classroom, Rita was already smirking at me again, but I paid her no mind. At that moment, Fred walked over, his eyes soft as they settled on Rita. "Would you like to go to the party with me?" Rita's cheeks turned pink, and she nodded, her voice almost shy. "I would." Fred smiled, satisfied, then turned to leave. But just as he passed me, he hesitated. "Fiona, do you have a dance partner?" The classroom went silent. Fred glanced at Rita, offering a rushed explanation. "I was just worried. In case no one invited you. I didn't want to leave you waiting, alone." Rita's expression, which had tensed slightly, relaxed at his words. I let out a small, amused smile. "Don't worry. I already have a dance partner." I turned to the corner of the room and gestured toward Aston. "I've already invited him." Fred's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering across his face. It looked like he wanted to say something, but in the end, he simply turned and walked back to his seat. And just like that, the past was starting to change. In the blink of an eye, it was the night before the party. A sudden knock on the door startled me. When I opened it, there was no one outside, only a carefully placed gift box. I picked it up and carried it to the balcony, where I spotted Aston standing downstairs. "I'm heading back now," he called out, waving at me from a distance. A small smile tugged at my lips as I waved back. "Go on then." Aston had always been considerate. He knew it was dark, that I was home alone, and so instead of stepping inside, he simply made sure I received his gift safely before leaving. Curious, I carefully lifted the lid of the gift box. Inside lay a breathtaking dark green evening dress, spaghetti straps, vintage elegance, timeless beauty. My breath hitched, my fingers trembling as I traced the delicate fabric. I knew this dress. In my previous life, I had seen it before, plastered across the covers of multiple fashion magazines, celebrated for both its stunning design and the heartfelt story behind it. The dress had been created by a designer for his dearest friend, with the hope that one day she would see it and know it was meant for her. And now, that designer was Aston, and that best friend was me. A sharp ache spread through my chest. Back. Then, when I was curled up in a tiny, dimly lit rental room, drowning in self-pity, I had thought I was utterly alone. I never knew that somewhere in the world, someone had always been thinking of me. Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. I hurriedly wiped them away, terrified they might stain the dress. My phone buzzed, breaking my trance. It was a message from Aston. Do you like it? My fingers moved before I could think. I love it very much. Thank you, my best friend. For a moment, the chat box showed him typing. Then, finally, he sent a single smiley face. That's what I wanted to hear. I clutched my phone to my chest, laughing, and crying all at once, feeling both ridiculous and incredibly happy. Just as I thought the night couldn't take any more unexpected turns, another knock sounded at my door. For a brief second, my heart leaped. Had Aston come back? I rushed to open it, only to be greeted by a man in a suit and sunglasses, standing stiffly with a gift box in hand. The outfit is from Mr. Luther, he said flatly. Fred Luther? A frown crept onto my face. 3 question marks popped up in my head. You must be mistaken, I said, eyeing the box warily. My name is Fiona. You should be delivering this to Rita. The man didn't flinch. No, it's for you. Miss Rita's outfit is being delivered separately. A chill ran down my spine. What? Is Fred up to now? I was about to shut the door, but the man stopped me. Mr. Luther asked me to tell you that since you come from a poor family, you likely can't afford an evening dress, he said, his tone as indifferent as ever. This dress is worth $33,000, Miss Fiona. It's probably the most expensive thing you'll ever wear in your life. I exhaled sharply, narrowing my eyes. Did Fred tell you to say that too? The man shook his head. Even if he didn't, I understand. His gaze flicked toward the dress box. This is also his favorite color. Blue. And just like that, I understood. This wasn't a gift. This was a calculated move, a veiled suggestion. If I wore this dress, I would be making a statement, willingly stepping into Fred's world. I let out a short, cold laugh. If your master loves it so much, I said slowly, why don't you take it back and let him wear it himself? The man stiffened. Or, I dragged my gaze over him, a smirk curling my lips. You wear it. Go to his room at midnight. You might have a chance too. His face remained blank, but his silence told me everything. I didn't give him time to recover. I slammed the door shut. Leave now or I'm calling the police. 3, 2. I barely reached 1 before I heard hurried footsteps retreating down the hallway. When I cracked the door open again, the unwanted gift box still sat outside. I rolled my eyes and grabbed my phone, immediately calling a local courier service. Where? Would you like to send it? The delivery guy asked. I had been about to say Fred's house, but at the last second, an idea struck me. Rita's house, I said instead, smiling as I handed over the package. Cash on delivery. The next evening, a text popped up on my phone. I'm waiting for you downstairs. Aston. Heart pounding. I threw on a blazer and rushed outside. There, under the warm glow of the setting sun, Aston leaned against his bicycle, waiting for me beneath a sycamore tree. The golden light bathed the road in a soft shimmer, and for a moment, the image before me felt surreal, like something out of a dream. And this time, I wasn't going to let the moment slip away. On the big screen of my past life, he had been different, hiding behind thick glasses, his hair always neatly combed but without a hint of style. But now, standing in front of me, he had shed that old image. His hair was soft, styled in gentle waves, and though he wore nothing but clean, simple, casual clothes, there was an undeniable air of nobility about him. And then, our eyes met. For a brief moment, everything stilled. A flicker of recognition, a shared surprise, and something deeper that neither of us could quite name. Do I look good? I asked, stepping closer. Aston nodded, his gaze unwavering. You are the most beautiful girl I've ever seen, he said softly. A sudden warmth crept up my face. I looked away, brushing a hand over the fabric of my dress. "It's the dress," I mumbled. "It makes me look good. It's really beautiful. If you ever start a clothing company, I know this dress would be a bestseller." But Aston shook his head. "I don't want to sell this dress to anyone." His voice was quiet, but firm. "I always intended to give it to you. Only you can bring out its beauty." His words melted something inside me. Got it. I climbed onto the back of his bicycle, and he took me to the school party venue. The cool evening air brushed against my skin, but with every turn of the wheels, an old, buried memory clawed its way back to the surface. The auditorium, the backstage. In my past life, something had happened there. Something that had left scars, too deep to forget. Now, Rita was in the exact position I had been in back then. Would she go through the same thing? A storm of emotions churned inside me. Yes, I had been hurt. Badly. But most of my pain had been because of Fred. Rita. She had been little more than a bystander. If I stood by and did nothing today, wouldn't I be just like her back then? When I first returned to this life, I had burned with hatred. I had wanted Fred and Rita to suffer, to die even. But as the days passed, I found that I could no longer let revenge consume me. Maybe it was because I realized that there were people in this world worth cherishing. Maybe it was because I finally understood I shouldn't punish my own future for the sake of my past. And more than anything, I didn't want Aston to be dragged into my darkness. Softly, I asked, "Aston, if you were bullied before, and one day the person you disliked was in the same situation, would you warn them?" Aston turned to look at me. "I wouldn't." I fell silent. "But I hope you do," he added. I blinked, stunned. Why? Most people wouldn't. Even I wouldn't, normally. Because even if I stayed silent, I wouldn't feel guilty. "But you would," Aston said, as if reading my thoughts. His voice was gentle, yet certain. "You would feel guilty. You'd have that weight pressing on your heart. Because you're a kind person, Fiona." I clenched my fists. Kind and stupid, right? "No." His voice was uncharacteristically firm. "You're not stupid. You're just being yourself. And as long as your kindness doesn't harm you, no one has the right to judge you. I just hope you always put yourself first." I swallowed. My eyes felt warm. "What if I make a mistake?" I whispered. Aston smiled. "You won't. But even if you do, I'll be your support. I'll bear it with you. We're best friends, aren't we?" My heart ached in the best way possible. Yes. And in that moment, I made my decision. When we stepped into the bright, dazzling hall of the auditorium, whispers erupted around us. "Who is that? Is that Fiona? Look at the dress she's wearing. Is that haute couture? It looks so expensive. But wait, who's the guy next to her?" People started gathering around us, throwing curious glances our way. And then Aston spoke, his voice unmistakable, and a new wave of realization washed over them. "Wait, is that Aston? The old-fashioned bookworm from our class?" The way they looked at me instantly changed. Some pulled me aside, whispering, "Did you always know Aston was this handsome?" I smiled. Of course. Aston had always been adorable as a child. Fair-skinned, tender, well-behaved. Otherwise, I wouldn't have tolerated his slow nature and insisted on dragging him out to play with me. I caught his gaze and gave him a subtle look. Help me deal with these classmates, because I had somewhere I needed to be. Backstage. My heart pounded as I pushed past the curtain, only to freeze at the sound of a familiar, sickly sweet voice. Long time no see, great makeup artist. My breath caught. Rita. She stood there, laughing and chatting with someone I recognized all too well, the very same makeup artist who had deliberately given me an ugly makeover in my past life. Rita covered her mouth, giggling. "I heard you're doing makeup for celebrities now. I guess I won't be able to get you anymore." The makeup artist waved a hand dismissively. "What are you talking about? We've known each other for years. If you call me, how could I not come?" A sharp, painful buzz filled my ears. "Hey, Fiona." Rita turned to me with a bright smile, pulling the makeup artist toward me. "First of all, your dress is stunning, and let me introduce you. This is my childhood friend." I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms to keep myself steady. My chest tightened. "Did you specially invite her today?" My voice came out steady, but there was an edge I couldn't suppress. Rita flipped her hair, looking proud. "Of course! Otherwise, with her fame, who could get her?" She winked at me. "Fiona, you're really missing out by not performing today." The makeup artist laughed. "All right, stop flattering me. You should get your makeup done. You're going on stage soon." I stood frozen, watching them chatter like old friends, my breathing turning shallow. Rita wasn't a bystander. She was a player in the game. The hatred I had spent days trying to suppress clawed its way back, burning hotter, fiercer, wilder than ever before. No wonder. No wonder such a famous makeup artist had come to our school for just a small party. No wonder in my past life she had specifically targeted me, a complete stranger. It had never been random. It had never been a coincidence. In my past life, I had humiliated myself on stage, and after I stumbled off, devastated and ashamed, Rita had rushed over, her face filled with righteous indignation. It must have been those jealous girls, she had told me back then. The ones who secretly had a crush on Fred, and like a fool, I had believed her. "Fiona, is Rita inside?" A voice from behind shattered my spiraling thoughts. Fred. Hearing him snapped me back to the present. I turned just as he caught sight of me, and for a fleeting moment, amazement flashed in his eyes, before his expression quickly twisted into a frown. "Why aren't you wearing that dress?" Before I could answer, Rita's voice rang out from the dressing room. "Fred, you're here." She practically floated out, wearing a blue dress. That blue dress. Fred's entire body stiffened. His eyes flickered. Panic, guilt, something unreadable. All of it flashing too quickly for him to hide. Rita beamed at him, tilting her head playfully. "You're so funny. Sending me one dress was already enough, but two? Although this one doesn't quite fit me. I think you'd like this one better, so I'm wearing it. How is it? Does it look good?" She twirled for him, the fabric flowing around her. Fred's smile was stiff, forced. "It looks good." Pleased. Rita leaned in and kissed him, lightly on the cheek. "I'm going to perform now. Cheer for me." Then, without a second glance, she flitted toward the stage, leaving Fred standing there, still frozen. I watched him, silent for a long moment, before I finally spoke. "Did you tell Rita?" Fred stiffened, his head snapping toward me. "Tell her what?" His voice was too quick, too defensive. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "That you secretly sent me a dress." His whole body tensed. "I meant to return it to you, but accidentally sent it to Rita," I added lightly. Fred's expression flickered between awkwardness and annoyance. "You two are good friends. I just casually sent a dress. What's the big deal?" I nodded, playing along. "You're right. Since it's no big deal, I'll just tell Rita later." Fred's face immediately changed. "You wouldn't dare," he hissed, his voice low and sharp. I tilted my head, eyes gleaming. "Why wouldn't I?" He was about to snap back when his phone suddenly rang. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time, I saw something close to fear flash in his eyes. He quickly answered. A sharp, shrill voice erupted from the other end. After hanging up, Fred frantically scanned the area, looking for someone, anyone, who could help him. But when no one else was around, he turned back to me, his expression sour, like he was being forced to swallow poison. "Fiona, I need a favor." I raised an eyebrow. "Why should I help you?" He exhaled sharply, gritting his teeth. "If you block my mom when she gets here, stop her from interrupting Rita's performance, I'll pay you. And..." He hesitated, then reluctantly added, "I'll throw in hush money for the dress. I'll give you 50,000. I smiled and immediately pulled up my payment code. "No need to wait until it's done. Pay now." Fred's jaw tightened. He still thought I was the same girl from before, still believed I was just looking for his attention. I lifted my chin. "I want 100,000, and don't forget to note it as a voluntary gift." Fred's eyes widened in disbelief. His phone rang again, and this time he had no choice. He hurriedly scanned the code and clicked pay. Just before the payment processed, I stood on tiptoe and casually tapped an extra 0 on his phone. Fred froze. His face recognition locked in before he could react. The screen flashed. "Payment successful. 1,000 received." I grinned. Young Master Fred truly has the means. Fred looked like he was about to vomit blood. "You..." Before he could finish, I gave him an innocent look. "Oh, but let me make it clear. I can't guarantee I'll stop your mom." His face twisted. "When did you make that clear?" I shrugged. The money was already paid, wasn't it? Fred's mouth opened, then closed. The sharp sound of high heels echoed in the hallway, growing closer. Panic flashed across his face. Mrs. Luther had arrived, draped in luxurious fur, heels clicking against the floor. Her jewelry glittered under the lights as she stepped inside, eyes sharp and searching. Her voice was like a blade. "Which one is Rita? Let me see which vixen is seducing my son." The air in the room shifted. Conversations quieted. Classmates exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak. Mrs. Luther pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos, comparing each face with ruthless precision. Then, her gaze darkened. "She's not here." She lifted her head, expression icy. "She must be on stage." As I watched Mrs. Luther rush toward the stage, I instinctively blocked her path, firmly telling her to step aside. Her hand shot up, aiming to strike me, but my reflexes were quick, and before her slap could land, I delivered one of my own. The sharp sound of the slap echoed backstage, and Mrs. Luther stood in stunned disbelief, her cheek turning bright red. "You dare to hit me," she stammered. I glanced at Fred, who was watching from the crack in the dressing room door, equally shocked. He had only asked me to stop her, not to strike her. I gave him a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Fred. This one's for you." Mrs. Luther seethed, her voice trembling. "What could we possibly talk about after what you did?" she demanded. I lowered, my voice adding, "Aren't you here to settle things with Rita? I'm her best friend, and I know everything you're looking for." In that moment, everything fell into place. The makeup artist had been hired by Rita, and memories from my past life began to resurface. I finally understood how Mrs. Luther had found my house and learned so much about me. It was all because of Rita. Now I would return the favor, just as it had been handed to me. I calmly told Mrs. Luther, "If you rush up there now, it'll ruin your reputation, and it will only worsen things with your son. You have better ways of dealing with this. Why make a scene yourself?" She studied me, and I leaned in, whispering, "That slap just now? It was your son's idea." Her eyes widened in shock. I continued, "He went to great lengths to protect Rita. Do you think a scene will really break them up?" Mrs. Luther began to calm down, and I saw an opportunity. I pulled out my payment code and offered it to her. 100,000 per piece, no credit. I'll give you a 10% discount for that slap. She left without saying much, and Fred finally emerged from the dressing room, letting out a relieved sigh. I counted the zeros on my phone screen, satisfied with the outcome. Fred asked how I had managed it, and I gave a sly smile. Trade secret. The applause from Rita's performance echoed in the background as she came off stage, only to be met with Fred, who embraced her. But I could see the subtle pity in the eyes of those around her. Rita, panicking, asked what was wrong, but Fred stood by her, keeping the truth hidden. I smiled and waved, telling them I had to leave. As I exited the backstage area, I found Aston among the crowd. Without asking any questions, he looked at me with bright eyes, his relief palpable. The night unfolded with music and whispers as Rita clashed with Mrs. Luther outside. Meanwhile, I pulled Aston to a quiet corner. "Would you like to dance the first dance with me?" I asked, and we held hands as we slipped away from the chaos. 3 days later, Rita transferred to another school. It was rumored that her family's company had been targeted by the Luther family, and they were on the brink of bankruptcy. Rita's parents had traced the issue back to her past relationship, and in the end, they arranged for her swift departure. Rita clung to Fred, tears streaming down her face as they said their dramatic goodbyes. But soon after, Fred confronted me, anger burning in his eyes. "I know what you've been doing behind our backs," he growled. I smiled innocently. "I did everything I promised. I didn't tell Rita about the dress you gave me, and I helped you. Stop your mom from ruining her performance." Fred's voice rose as he accused me. "But you took money from my mom." I blinked in surprise. "I never said I only took your money." Fred stood speechless for a moment before threatening, "Just wait and see." I turned back to the classroom, feeling a surge of satisfaction, only to find Aston waiting by the door. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes darting to Fred's retreating figure. I reassured him, but the next day, everything changed. I received a call from Aston's parents. He was in the hospital. When I arrived, I found out he had fought with Fred at the entrance of my neighborhood. Aston had only minor injuries, but Fred had ended up in the emergency room. Despite his parents' insistence, Aston refused to explain what had happened until I arrived. It was only then that I saw a rare moment of vulnerability in him. Aston looked at me, regret and frustration clear in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I wanted to let you handle it, but I just couldn't hold back." I shook my head, unable to blame him. Seeing him finally open up brought a sense of relief to his parents, and they breathed a sigh of comfort. I turned to them, feeling a pang of guilt. "It's my fault for causing trouble for you," I apologized. His mother smiled warmly, her kindness comforting me. "Silly child," she said gently. "We know you two are close, and protecting a friend is always the right thing to do. Aston did the right thing today. You don't need to worry about the Luther family. We'll handle it." She patted my head, and for a moment, I felt like I was a child again, receiving that same warmth I hadn't felt in so long. My eyes softened as a wave of gratitude washed over me. All these years, I hadn't visited them, yet they still treated me with the same kindness as ever. As we drove home, I composed myself and spoke seriously. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, this whole situation is because of me. I'll take full responsibility." I had been waiting for a chance to explain, but I never imagined it would come so suddenly. Aston's parents exchanged a look before turning to me with understanding. "Fiona," Mrs. Wilson began, her voice calm. "Even if it weren't for you, we were already planning to sever ties with the Luther family." I was stunned. She continued, "When your family went bankrupt, we also suffered heavy losses. It was all because of the Luther family's manipulations. We've been trying to gather evidence against them for years, but only recently did we find some clues during our dealings with them. So don't blame yourself, Fiona. We were bound to clash with the Luther family sooner or later. As I processed her words, my expression grew serious. So the Luther family had been behind my family's downfall all along. I lowered my head, feeling the weight of it. I quickly searched through my phone and found a document I had been holding on to. It was a collection of leads I'd gathered in my past life. As a way to keep going in my final years, I had immersed myself in the scandals of the Luther family: tax evasion, shoddy construction, bribing officials, all of it, documented meticulously. It was the only thing that had kept me going, knowing that one day they would fall. But in that lifetime, the Luther family had grown too powerful for anyone to bring down. Now, though, things were different. The Luther family wasn't as untouchable as they once were. Mrs. Wilson took the document from Aston and eagerly read through it. Her eyes lit up. "Fiona, this is incredibly useful," she exclaimed. I held my breath. "Can this completely bankrupt the Luther family?" I asked quietly. She nodded firmly. "I promise you, it can." Relief flooded through me, and my clenched fist relaxed. Finally, the pain they caused my family and me could be repaid. The next day, Fred didn't show up to school. It was rumored that he had been in the hospital. Half a month later, his seat was empty, and no one knew exactly what had happened. I could tell that Fred's family was in turmoil, and only Aston and I knew the truth. They were dealing with the fallout of their bankruptcy. I saw Fred again months later, after the college entrance exams. But he was no longer the confident, charismatic school heartthrob he once was. He was crouching in front of my apartment complex, looking worn and defeated. Aston's frown deepened at the sight of him, and I signaled for him to stay calm, knowing that Fred's downfall was just beginning. Fred approached us, ignoring Aston, and asked about the transfer. I found the record and pointed to the words, "Voluntary gift," with a slight smile. "Sorry, no refunds." Fred's eyes were bloodshot, and his voice quivered with frustration. "You want to destroy me because you can't have me, is that it?" Aston and I exchanged confused glances, unsure of what he was referring to. I felt a strange mix of awkwardness and amusement at his words. Before I could respond, Fred's face twisted in complete despair. "Now that I'm like this, are you happy? Seeing me beg in front of you, does it make you proud?" His words struck me with an odd force, and I gradually wiped away the smile that had begun to form. I looked at Fred, my tone steady. "Fred Luther, I never take pleasure in trampling on others' dignity. All I ever wanted was a normal life. But some people didn't see me as human. They treated me like a tool, a shield, playing with my feelings, trampling on my self-respect, and watching me cry and beg for help without lifting a finger." Fred froze, clearly shocked, as if he hadn't expected me to see through his manipulations. I stared at him, my expression cold. "But I'm different from them. When I see you in misery now, I don't feel the pride or disdain you once felt when you looked at me. All I feel is one thing." Fred's lips trembled as he asked, "What feeling?" I smiled softly, my voice calm and unwavering. "A sense of relief, because you and Rita are no longer the main characters in this story. You're no longer above everyone else, looking down on us like we're ants. You've become ordinary people, just like the rest of us, and your story is over." I took Aston's hand and walked past Fred without a second glance. Aston squeezed my hand gently, and with a soft smile said, "Mom made your favorite cake." I nodded and smiled back, feeling warmth spread through me. This moment, walking away from the past, meant something new. My life was just beginning. If you like this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories, like these only at StoryTimes.